All right, so welcome to another T-Rex Talk podcast. This is Isaac Botkin, and I have with me a special guest this week. I am talking to Jonathan Wild, better known to some of you on the internet as Wild Arms Research and Development. And what Wild Arms Research and Development primarily researches and develops is munitions, or maybe I should let you explain what it is that you do. I find the munitions part particularly interesting.
So basically what we specialize in is what legally would be called destructive devices.
That's a much more exciting way to put it, yeah.
So our launchers typically are inert, the projectile, but the mechanism itself, the launcher and the ammunition being propelled is, live. There's just no kaboom at the end. Hopefully one day when we get a license, we will have the kaboom. But for now, what we like to do is historically research launchers from history. For now, it's been World War II. But we're branching out to, more modern times. But we do research, we build a launcher, we test it, and we write books with our results and data and kind of give the reader an understanding of, an in-depth look at the launcher.
And so currently you have a couple of books that are out. You have one on the Panzerfaust, which was your first book, I believe. And then you've got a new book that's out relatively recently that we have a copy of at the office.
Yes. The first one was Expedient Recoilless Launcher, Panzerfaust. And that was our first. That was, I'd say, the most basic design. And then the new book is on the Fliegerfaust. A lot of people struggle to pronounce that.
That's why I was going to let you say it first, just to double check.
Yeah, a lot of people, I had to watch a few, German videos pronouncing it correctly. But yeah, it's Fliegerfaust. And I'm sure some German will get mad. But to my understanding, that is the correct pronunciation for that.
Which brings me to a question. As you have built these devices, these are functional copies of previous anti-material weapons. Are you going for kind of a modernized version or a totally accurate historical reproduction? What's kind of your main focus with these projects?
We try to get as accurate as possible while using modern techniques. So the Panzerfaust was pretty straightforward. We just kind of copied the design with that. The Fliegerfaust, which is an actual rocket launcher, and later we can go into detail what the two differences are between a rocket launcher and a recoilless launcher. But we used a lot of 3D printed steel for the Fliegerfaust. Obviously, Germany did not have 3D printed steel printers back in the day. But based on our experience and, limitations of machining, we figured, printing it there's a lot of hard, intricate parts that need to be machined in difficult ways. And it was just cheaper just to print the part as is. So we try to copy it as close as we can to the original. We add a little bit of flair, like I added a red dot to the Fliegerfaust. That obviously wasn't a thing, but it was removable. I just unscrew it and take it off. The goal is to try and make it as realistic as possible, including the ammunition.
That was the other question that I had, because it looks like you are capable of using, it looks like a more modern 20 millimeter ammunition, because 20 millimeter ammunition is still around. It is still, available is probably the wrong term for people like you and me, but it is still used by a lot of folks.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you had adapted that so that it could potentially use the modern stuff, or you were specifically designing it around the cartridges or the munitions of the day.
So the projectile that I used for my 20 millimeter rockets for the Fliegerfaust, to get an exact German replica of that round would be very expensive, especially if I'm shooting 20 to 30 rockets. So I went with the 20 millimeter Vulcan training projectile with the big blue ones.
Yes, yeah.
It's basically to match the HE round in terms of the weight, but in general, it's a more modern. In theory, if you took the rocket motor, you put a live HE round, it should work.
But that's not something that we would recommend that people do immediately without the appropriate paperwork, oversight, etc. Yes.
Of course, yeah.
But just speaking from a purely abstract, theoretical, physical hypothesis, It sounds very sound.
Yes, it would technically work because if it can launch the training projectile, it can physically launch the live projectile. If you are inclined to own them, and there are people that do own them, and someone reached out to me who does own them, was potentially willing to do an experiment with them. I just haven't been able to get down to their state. I believe they're over in Arizona.
Okay.
As we grow, we can open up the possibilities with getting someone who's licensed. And what license you really need is a federal explosives license.
Mm-hmm.
And what that allow you to do is basically you paid your tax, you've met the storage requirements, boom, you can play with the big, the forbidden explosives. So
it's a kind of a fascinating world. I know a gentleman. He and a group of friends did not only did they do all the paperwork for owning destructive devices, but they also did all the import paperwork. They have a German 88, and so generally speaking, they fire training ammunition through it, but they also have the paperwork to have and to use some non-training ammunition for it, and that's a fascinating hobby. Obviously, it's a hobby for people with money, but that is a whole other kind of world. Obviously, many of us in the gun industry have various aspects to the hobby. Some of us have done FFL and SOT stuff so that we can have, the forbidden suppressors and fully automatic weapons. But there's a whole other class of people. There's collectors, and then there's people who do stuff with these destructive devices, and that's pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be my goal. I would love to get, I think it's a Class 10 FFL. And then a federal explosives license when I can, justify it and, get, you need the storage requirements are obviously kind of strict. So when I'm capable of doing that, I'm definitely looking at doing that.
And I will say, while I oppose weapon restrictions and firearm controls and things like that, I do say that storing explosive weapons is something that you do want to do properly. Just because the government says that you should be safe and not store deadly, dangerous explosives just under your bed, just because the government says it doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah, it's a smart, common sense thing to don't store your explosives next to your heater or any other flammable materials, your fireplace, for instance. And I think a large part of it. Of the project that I'm doing is people think they need a license to own a destructive device. And to own it as an individual, you do not need a license. It's only when you're in the business of selling or transferring, or people will come to my channel or watch my videos and they had no idea it was legal. And it's like, it's been legal since they were invented. And they only were regulated, I believe, in the 60s with the Gun Control Act, basically creating the definition of destructive device, which a destructive device is either a poisonous, explosive, or an incendiary bomb, missile, basically anything that goes kaboom over a 1/4 ounce of explosive, or it's a firearm with a bore of over 1/2 inch. And they have exemptions. So obviously a 12 gauge is above a 1/2 inch, but it has a sporting purpose. So the government has allowed that to continue unregulated. And that's why there's several shotguns that have been, I think it was the UTAS and the Street Sweeper. The government basically said they're evil and they turn them into destructive devices. So now if you wanted to buy one of those, you have to buy it as an NFA item.
Yes, because you would never, the Street Sweeper is a particularly interesting one because it's just a drum magazine. It's a 12 gauge with a drum magazine, and it's not even a particularly good one. I know that they were pretty finicky to work with. There's shotguns with box magazines that are far more dangerous, but
I mean, a Sega 12 can do anything a striker can do, or not a striker, a Street Sweeper.
But Street Sweeper shows up in like 1980s and 1990s gun control debates by name, and so that's how you know it's especially bad. Like it's almost like a Tech 9.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, but because of that law that I'm aware of, there was only 2 major crimes that were committed with what we would call a destructive device today. There was an attempted bazooka firing on, I think, a UN building back in the 60s. And then someone used a 20 millimeter, it was anti-material rifle to rob a bank. Outside of there, it was never been used in crime, but because they were high-profile incidents at the time, those firearms were now regulated.
So UN attack, bank attack. I do want to point out that here on the show, we do discourage people from robbing banks. I think that's a very important distinction that we should make, and just call that out and point out that that's a problem.
I was going to say, no one was injured in any of those attacks. The bazooka, which is the model that was used, it ended up just landing in the water. It was fired over a river. It didn't make it over the river. And then the 20 millimeter just was used to break open a vault.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
No one was hurt.
Well, and what is interesting is that's just here in the United States. Obviously, there have been some destructive devices used, homemade explosive projectile launchers that have been used in other countries. I think probably the one that is the most famous or the most known is people building recoilless rifles in Northern Ireland.
The design you're referring to is commonly known as the PRIG, the PRIG. That saw extensive use in the Troubles in Ireland or Northern Ireland. And what that was a recoilless launcher. So you have a tube. Inside the tube, you have a projectile. In this case, it was Semtex explosive in a bean can. And then you had a rod with, stabilizing fins. And then you had black powder propellant. And then behind the black powder propellant, you had biscuits. And essentially those biscuits, or what Americans would call cookies, would act as a countermass between the projectile, the propellant, and the countermass. When that ignited, it would basically allow a recoilless effect, but you still get a decent, the projectile is launched at a decent speed and range.
Obviously, there are many reports of it working well, but I have seen some footage, or rather a picture of a van, or as the British would call it, a lorry, where the doors weren't opened before it was fired, and it's not a good thing to use in a confined space.
Yeah. Anything that goes forward is going to end up coming back in a recoilless design. I know in our Panzerfaust testing, which is a similar design but without the countermass, we just use a lot more propellant. Even with that, anything behind it, maybe a 2 or 3 foot, is going to get cooked. We laid a cardboard silhouette target that got burned to shreds. So yeah, you don't want to shoot that type of device in a vehicle, in a house, ideally outdoor, backblast, clear. I'm sure, there's several videos online of what happens when someone's behind the with their RPG or something like that.
There's RPG-7s are often used in scenarios where I don't think the people using them have really calculated their backblast area properly. So that's the one that I've seen the most. But this is, I will say this is something that is no joke to play with. You obviously are not dealing with warheads, with explosives, but even that propellant is a considerable amount of power. And so, it's a very fascinating job that you have undertaken. And I'm sure that you take a lot of precautions and are extremely careful, but this isn't something that you recommend that people just go out and do for fun necessarily.
No, I typically wouldn't recommend to do it on your own unless you really know what you're doing. And at that point, you don't need my help. You're probably more experienced than I am. But generally, yes. With recoilless launchers, and I should probably just explain the differences now between a recoilless launcher and a rocket launcher. A recoilless launcher is essentially what I described the PRIG as. So what that is, it's, you're using black powder, you're using it in a tube, half of it, one part of the pressure is coming out the back and the other part of the pressure is pushing the projectile forward. And that's what creates, the recoilless effect and projecting it. Whereas a rocket is obviously, a self-contained rocket. It's burning a fuel in a pressurized case, and it will continue to burn until the fuel is up, and that's what propels the rocket. Typically, there will be a lot of backblast, but that's more of the escaping fuel, essentially the exhaust from the rocket. Uh, Typically, rockets, if they explode, they're very dangerous. And when they explode, they shrapnel, and that is the biggest danger I personally think we look out for is the rocket made to withstand overpressure of a rocket motor. With a recoilless launcher, you're designing the launch tube to handle the maximum pressure you're expecting to face with the propellant. You can make mistakes, or you could have a projectile get stuck and overpressurize the tube or the launch tube, and that could break and rupture. And there was a good book on the Prig, and the author who made this, his blew up, and he showed that in his book. And I think that was due to icy temperatures, and he used a weird countermass that didn't quite leave the barrel, so it would basically kept the propellant inside without what's the word, pushing all the pressure in an equal manner. So it built up and it ruptured the tube because it wasn't supposed to handle. You can avoid that by, one, not shooting it in the snow, and generally making sure your barrel is clean. You using consistent materials in your the powder charge, the cardboard tube for the powder charge. Generally make sure that there's no way for it to not do its function. Or stick the barrel in the ground, and there's nowhere for that back pressure to go. Yeah, you're going to blow up the tube. But with a rocket, any rocket can explode. And that's the real danger of shooting rockets. So the first project I did was a recoilless launcher. The Fliegerfaust is a rocket. It shoots 9 20-millimeter rockets, and those can explode very easily. If propellant breaks off and clogs the nozzle, again, overpressure, the rocket explodes, shrapnel. Another way is if there's an air pocket in the fuel. So I make all the fuel myself. I had someone who's a rocket enthusiast teach me how to make it. And part of the lessons, it took several batches to make a suitable fuel for my rockets. The biggest issue we were looking at was air pockets in the fuel. While it's burning, if it hits an air pocket, that'll increase the pressure. And if it's too much pressure, it's just going to, kaboom the rocket before it even either leaves the barrel. And if it leaves the barrel, it could kaboom, within 5-10 feet of your face. And you typically don't want that.
Yeah. So this is, it's a risky thing to shoot factory-made rockets. Glad that you're taking a lot of the precautions. But I'm curious, what even led you to pursue this as an endeavor in the first place?
So I got my started, I guess, in the firearm industry back in 2017. And what I was really trying to do was come up with a new type of regular, ammunition. So it was a semi-caseless design.
I do want to talk about this. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. We can talk about that later, but essentially I couldn't fund I couldn't fund the project as, at the time I was in college. I didn't have, a really high paying job. So I couldn't really fund it, and, it's not easy to get funding in that situation. So, I patented certain designs and, worked on that on the side, and then I realized, someone was selling RPG-2 tubes for people to build. And I reached out to him, and I couldn't afford the RPG-2 tube, but I could afford the Panzerfaust tube. So I'm like, yeah, I'll give that a try. He doesn't have any other, he hasn't done the development for that yet. But his RPG-2 build worked fine. So I figured, I'll just do a Panzerfaust. And I was a big fan of P.A. Ludi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
I am indeed. So P.A. Ludi is definitely someone who I admire for his desire to point out flaws with firearm laws and do that by making functional firearms. One of the British gun control schemes, their main point is if we take the guns away from people, no one will have guns because it's impossible for regular people to make them. And P.A. Ludi said, hold my lager. And went into his shed and did what good British blokes do and created submachine guns using just raw materials that you could get anywhere and hand tools that anyone would have. And he won, I would say, moral victories, not legal victories, but he won moral victories and demonstrated great courage and published a book on exactly how you could do what he did.
Yes. And that was a big inspiration because I always wanted to have a book like that. When I, got into firearms at 18, I bought all the books from Paladin Press, who was the publisher at the time for P.A. Ludi,
yes.
and a bunch of other books.
Ragnar Benson.
Mm-hmm. Bill Holmes was another firearm. He did like 50 cals and submachine guns and pistols. I loved all that stuff. So, I was like, well, people have done recoilless launchers books before, but they're all done in the 80s and 90s, black and white. It was quality of the era.
Pre-internet stuff. Yeah. It's a fascinating time. So this stuff fascinated me. I may or may not have built a Ragnar Benson flamethrower out of a fire extinguisher. Not at the time that those books first came out, because I'm not quite that old, but the dissemination of this kind of information pre-internet is fascinating to me. And I definitely remember those days pretty clearly, back when my dad was working in politics and information was disseminated through VHS tapes and mailed newsletters. And that was the way that you got messages out to people outside of, the 3 television networks that existed. And it's fascinating to have seen how that developed, and to the point where you are... I definitely see you doing these experiments, documenting your results, publishing books, very much in that Paladin Press, P.A. Ludi style. But you are not the only backyard weapons experimenter that I'm aware of. The internet has revealed this to be a pretty widespread hobby, and there's a ton of guys who are 3D printing all kinds of experimental small arms. And that is a fascinating thing. But I wanted to talk to you because you are doing something above and beyond the basics, which a lot of us are watching. People printing their own Glock lowers, people printing their own AR-15 receivers, et cetera, et cetera. And you are doing something that really stands apart from that. Not to put those guys down or to downplay the nobility of their task, but you have chosen something that is a little different than your average homemade firearms enthusiast.
Yes. So I think there's a pretty good progression of, back in the 80s, 90s, we had the Paladin Press. And I think today the more modern version of that is, doing PDFs and giving the files out. The famous one is the FGC9. I'm sure you've seen it. Yes. From J. Stark Defense Distributed, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And basically, it's open source. You don't have to buy a book. You download the files online, presumably from a VPN. And you get your guide, per se, and you can build their submachine gun or semi-automatic 9mm handgun or pistol. If you look at, I guess, our laws, what we would.
It depends on your definition.
Yeah.
I don't even know what they call that thing in Europe. It's like 10 crimes in one. But
yeah.
Over here, it's just a pistol.
Yeah, pretty much just a pistol. Unless you print the stock, then it's an evil rifle. But as it is, if you just print the parts without the stock, it's a pistol. And I think that's becoming the trend. So you have various groups from, Are We Cool Yet? Is another big group that releases files. Defense Distributed, FOSCAT. There's countless groups that are doing this, and this is exploding over the last 5-10 years. I think more of the last 5, I'd say. But what I'm doing is kind of bridging the gap. It's kind of like that nostalgia, bringing Paladin Press into the modern era. Now, I also like the historical aspect. So typically my books won't just cover how I built the launcher, but also what is the historical use of it? What are examples of similar weapons? And what was the progression through time to what we have today? So with the Fliegerfaust, that was the first man-portable air defense weapon system that, you could carry and fire. And that progressed into, really basic guided missiles. And then what we have today, which is, really advanced, high tech, it goes, miles up, and it can pretty much take down most helicopters and most low-flying aircraft nowadays. But the books cover the history of, this is where we started, 20 millimeter unguided rockets, which, as if you've seen the videos, the accuracy is not what I would call good. But that's the point. No one had ever seen a Fliegerfaust fire. There's no recorded photos, no recorded video of it firing. So, what we did was we looked at the rockets. There were some live rockets in a collection in Arizona. I got photos of those rockets. I modified the design to be machinable with my friend Tornado Technology. They helped me make the rockets itself in a professional setting, which is what I wouldn't recommend doing rockets homemade. You could do them on a lathe. You could do them on a mill.
Yeah.
But the quality control is not there, so I'd be very careful. Compared to, a CNC machine, you can, make the same part 10 times and there won't be too much variation between the parts. But, we copied the design. We made our own fuel for it that was, compliant with U.S. law. And we were able to get a stabilized projectile. It wasn't like an Etsy rocket, a firework we just put in the tube. These are functional rockets. They spin very fast. We had high-speed cameras from Nick Chen.
It's amazing footage, yeah.
He drove up from, I think, California, and I was really grateful for him to film that footage because we didn't know how fast it was spinning, and it was spinning so fast that it created an effect that it looked like it was spinning and then going in reverse.
Yes.
And at first, he thought the rocket was changing direction as it spun, but it was just an optical illusion.
Yeah, just spinning faster, out of phase with the camera's frame rate, faster than, So I do want to just shout out to him. So Nick Chen is someone I've mentioned before in videos or podcasts where I've talked about night vision. He does a lot of great night vision research and thermal research for the community. So I'm so so pleased that he's helping you out too. He's
a good guy.
Yeah, he deserves a lot of credit. Yeah,
definitely. And Lucas, I believe Lucas D visited as well. He actually lives local to me. He's another writer for the Firearm blog. He helped set up a lot of things and record. The quality wouldn't have been what it was without their help. So I'm very grateful. And the footage they got was, we got to witness history in modern times with modern camera equipment. No more watching black and white footage, with, very grainy, you can't really see what's going on. You can kind of tell, but, to put it in a modern camera really, I think helped.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're doing, just pushes ticks all the boxes, pushes all the buttons, all my favorite stuff. You're doing weapons tests and experiments. You're bringing modern manufacturing. You're learning more about history. Like it's all the cool stuff. So what's next? Continued experiments with Fliegerfaust. I do know that you've said that your second book, the Fliegerfaust book, isn't selling as well as the Panzerfaust book. And I'm not really surprised because the Panzerfaust project is, it's certainly a better known weapon, and it seems like a much more understandable, approachable concept. So I guess that's not a huge surprise, but...
So with the Fliegerfaust project, I think it was partly to, right now we're going through, I don't want to get too political, but we're going through high inflation and, the book is a little more expensive than the other book. I think it could be the cost. And obviously the Fliegerfaust is not as common. I mean, I'm not going to, be too upset about it. I love the project. So where we're going forward from here is we're going to look at, America's past. Instead of looking at German weapons, we're going to look at an American design, which is called the M202 Flash. And what that was, it was designed to replace the flamethrower. Up until Vietnam, America was still using the same flamethrower. And obviously it had pretty good range, but, going into Vietnam, you needed more range to take out bunkers and fortified positions. Mm-hmm. And they designed this four-barreled rocket launcher that the goal was to fire an incendiary rocket. It actually used the same rocket motor as the M72 Law.
Okay.
So It's the same rocket. They just put a new projectile on it.
And
a new warhead.
And had 4 tubes in the launcher, so you had 4 shots instead of the 1.
Yeah. And you could, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you could fire all of them at the same time or like one after another really quickly, or you could do it semi-auto.
Okay. Do you have to make the semi-auto version in order for it to be legal? Is a machine gun rocket launcher something that the ATF is going to have thoughts about?
So with the Fliegerfaust, that fired 9 rockets at the same time. The kind of saving grace for that of why it's not a machine gun, and this is not legal advice. Don't use me in your when you're in court, but to my understanding, it falls under the volley fire category.
Gotcha. Yes.
And what that is, it's designed for older weapons that have multiple barrels. That when you pull the trigger, both barrels will fire. Because each barrel fires one rocket, and it's not capable of firing another rocket automatically without the function of reloading or the function of a trigger.
Gotcha. Yes.
It is not a machine gun. It can't be a machine gun. It can't fire multiple rounds. Each barrel has one round, and when it's fired, it's empty. With propellant, it's not like firearms where when the primer hits,
right,
it's almost instantaneous. There's no negligible difference in the delay time between the projectile igniting and firing. With rockets, unless you have an accelerant that you can mathematically time that will burn consistently, you're always going to have some deviation. So the Fliegerfaust, all 9 rockets, I guess, ignited, or 2 of them actually disconnected from the recoil.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. That's a fascinating concept as well, is because you have a cook-off is the wrong word, but when the rocket fuel actually gets going, it's at different times, and there may be enough exhaust, recoil, something to disengage the actual firing mechanism. I hadn't thought about that at all.
Yeah. So, we set all 9 off. I think 2 failed to ignite, and they kind of unplugged. They didn't quite go. And because of ATF's explosive laws, I'm trying to do my best to follow them. So I can't use any explosive material for commercial purposes. With the fuel I'm using, it's not considered a explosive material. So the fuel is okay. The ignition, the E-match, which is an electronic match, it's an ATF approved one that they say is, not regulated because it meets some criteria of theirs. They use it for hobby rockets and stuff. So I'm covered there. But the accelerant, I couldn't find any non-explosive material that would work as an accelerant just to get it to burn consistently and evenly.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things like that I can think of off the top of my head, which are initiators or accelerators, and you don't think of them as explosives, but they're far more tightly controlled than explosives are because they start that train.
Exactly. The ATF basically has put a wide net, and they got sued for the fuel. There was a 9-year lawsuit in the model or rocket community. They sued the ATF. It took 9 years, but eventually the court ruled that it's not an explosive. It can't be used in explosive, and basically slapped them on the wrist. That's fortunate for me because I can now build rockets and stay compliant. I'm making money technically off building rockets, but I'm not using explosive material, so the explosive law is exempt. I'm exempt at that point.
Your main downside is this issue of delay or latency.
Correct. So, as all 9 were lighting off, they left the barrel at different times, and it looked like it was a machine gun at that point. It was a bunch of rounds, when in reality, it should have come out roughly the same time or a lot closer. I mean, if you play the slow motion, it looks like one after another. If you play it in regular speed, it's kind of like a steady stream of rockets. In reality, the originals were intended to fire in 2 volleys, which I couldn't do legally because then that would maybe be considered a machine gun if I purposely delayed. Again, no one's really done this before, so there's no precedent on this particular. So I'm kind of walking a fine line, and when I'm like, okay, this is too close to the edge that I'm not willing to risk it, I won't.
Yeah, when you're publishing your book and you're going on podcast to explain exactly what you did, that's when you walk the line on the safe side, for sure.
Definitely. You got to be careful. And, I think any recommendation the ATF follows, I do my best to follow that. I'm trying to do this by the book. And ATF is not always consistent on, one, giving answers for questions. I've gotten conflicting reports about various questions. And then two, following the law. I mean, as you've seen with multiple things, they don't care about the definition. They'll change the definition to meet whatever criteria they're given to do, aka the reclassification of receivers and bump stocks and pistol braces.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter what the law says. If they want to change something, they will.
Yeah.
So I go above and beyond to be like, hey, look, I'm doing this. The launchers are registered. The ammunition is compliant with all state, local, federal laws. You just hope for the best. But, I've been doing this 2 years now. And, so far, so good, knock on wood. We're going to be seeking a lawyer to address some of the fuel limits that, if we get that figured out, more companies will have a better precedent of, maybe building products. Maybe there will be a company at some point building, novelty rocket launchers or recoilless launchers. And that information helps them, hey, there's money in this. Here's, this guy's done and got the research done, and, this is legal to do.
Yeah, I think it's really important work. And this is something that I find fascinating and have talked about a number of times, just how closely linked weapons research is to all technological development. And when you look at new developments in material science or in manufacturing technology or various things, I'd love to actually do like a serious survey of major technological advances and see how often they are connected to weapons research and development. But it's a lot. There's a whole bunch of precision machining and manufacturing technology that comes out of gun manufacturing. And obviously there's a whole bunch of material science that comes out of weapon research as well. So these are important areas of research, not just for the ability to shoot rockets, but all of the subsequent developments that come along, all of the things that get figured out along the way.
So when technology advances, I think we're going to be able to see, right now we have a lot of 3D printed guns out of plastic. And one of the things that I really liked about this project was incorporating 3D printed steel. I don't have a printer, and commercial printers are obviously out of the price range of, the consumer market. But I think, in the next 10, 15 years, that option is going to be more available. So I used outside companies that, help print parts. We modified them to be in spec. There's some limitations to 3D printing steel, and that's mainly there's roughly up to 0 to 5% shrinkage of your part. And it can be either shrink or it can expand in other areas. So it's kind of like casting almost. So you have to you have to be prepared to do modifications, and we certainly did modify a lot of the parts to function in this. And obviously, you can't have a printing company print a frame, because then they'd be making a firearm for you. So you can't have them print firearms or receivers. Now that is going to change how ATF defines. I don't know how that's going to affect whether they consider.
Oh, it remains to be seen. For sure. Now, one of the things that is kind of cool is I see tons of people tinkering with the SIG P320 because its frame is not actually the receiver. It's grip frame. It's module that you can print that or have other companies print that for you and then just drop in the fire control group mechanism. And so that I have seen a ton of people, Flux, and a whole bunch of other people just developing really cool, new, interesting pistol designs and letting other people print those simply because of that separate model. And yeah, it's occasionally the way that the ATF has set things up has actually simplified stuff for people in later on down the line and opens up a whole new area of innovation and exploration and discovery. And I'm sure that annoys certain people, but I find it fascinating.
Definitely.
So one of the things that I'm curious about, I don't know exactly what your thoughts on this are. I can kind of guess because Philip Ludi is someone that you wanted to emulate in some way, but what is the main reason that you're not pursuing some of this type of research for a company like Raytheon? Like, is there a specific reason that you want to do it as a civilian, and make your research just very available to the public?
So my background, I'm not actually an engineer. The math is too hard for me. But I feel like I'm working on older weapon designs that are a lot more simple. When they were created, they were probably mind-blowing inventions to, the general public. Obviously, 80 years later, these weapon systems are kind of really, you can do it all yourself, if that makes sense. You don't have to be a skilled engineer. And I think I wouldn't mind working for, a big firearms manufacturer like that. But again, another part of it is I like, I'm a firm firearms advocate. I'm originally from Canada and the UK. So I was born in Canada. I grew up in the UK. Obviously guns are a lot more restricted there, and I wasn't, a big fan of that. And that's kind of why I've published books. I could just be doing this for, money on YouTube and, not do books and just try to get money off ad revenue. But I think the knowledge should be out there. The historical knowledge should be out there. And the technical knowledge. I don't recommend people build anything in my books, but I think that knowledge should be there for the general public. I think more information, the better. It can be from a practical use or a historical use, but there's nothing wrong with that information being available to the general public.
Yeah, and for people to build on. There's plenty of great opportunities for people to be stimulated by something that they read in the way that something was done in the past. And a lot of times, this doesn't happen incredibly regularly, but it is fascinating when you see a piece of technology or an understanding of a certain principle get lost or forgotten briefly, and then people bring that back. And it's something that was maybe, a first-gen piece of technology that was made obsolete by a second-gen piece of technology, but then when the third generation of technology comes around, that principle from the first generation actually has benefits. It's worth reviving that. And some of these things change all the time. Like when the AK-47 first came out and the M16 first came out, AK-47 was a dirt cheap weapon and M16 was very expensive to make. But things have changed to the point where CNC machines cutting aluminum are way cheaper and easier to run than giant steel stamping factories. Like the cost and precision ratio has completely flopped over the last several decades. And so, yeah, there are historical things that weren't feasible at one point in time, and they're worth reviving and learning from. And as 3D printing gets more mature, I think that there are a whole bunch of elements of early rocketry that have been abandoned that are worth bringing back. I think things like solid fuel rockets. There are some very cool things that people are doing with 3D printing, not just the nozzles, but rocket fuels in such a way that you get some of the benefits of liquid fuel rockets. You get some of those benefits back by, I don't even know what they call it, but basically mixing your fuel so that it actually does what you want it to do gradually over time. Yeah, that's just one example, one reason that I think that this is a fascinating field to open up.
Yeah.
And not just leave in the hands of Raytheon and Boeing.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people in those, early industries got their start by doing it, as a project as a side project. So I think, it has value. As time goes by, we hope to build bigger and better weapons. So there's a couple designs that are rather big that are, it's a distant goal, but it's a goal nevertheless, of trying to take these designs and, scaling up. So another design that I want to do that uses the same kind of principle as the Fliegerfaust rockets, but it's much bigger. And that's basically the main gun on the Sturmtiger, which is a World War II tank. And the barrel on it is, I think, 380 millimeters or something ridiculous. But that shoots a rocket that functions in the same manner as my 20 millimeter rockets. So if I scale up the design, add a few, compensate for the larger, pressure. And in theory, my goal would be to build the biggest gun, biggest civilian-owned gun, which would be that.
I think that sounds like an admirable goal. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you got to have big goals, and, I know how to do it. It's whether, you got to fund it. You got to make sure it's safe. You got to have a place that will allow you to shoot that. I don't think, I typically do a lot of my launches either at a private range or, state forest or, like public land. But that might be pushing it. I'm sure if they see me wheeling out a big, half-ton gun.
300 millimeters is an enormous diameter. At that point, you can do guided munitions without even worrying about like microelectronics. You can just use
a barrel, yeah.
Full-sized radio controlled parts. You don't have to worry about miniaturization at all.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could damn near put someone in that thing. It's a big gun, and it basically was used as a bunker buster during World War II. And the projectile, I think it's like 100, 200 pounds or something ridiculous. But again, that's what I would like to do. If people keep buying books and they keep wanting to see this, that is like, I'm going to scale my way up to that. But regarding the guidance system, there's actually one of the few laws in this country prohibits completely, I guess, guided ammunition that can take down an aircraft.
Yes.
The only rocket that I know is really banned, that you can't form one and, have some kind of red tape to get to it, is, a functional modern manpad, which is, a guided rocket that seeks, an exhaust of an aircraft, or it seeks the image of an aircraft. Basically, that is completely banned.
Which, I mean, let's be honest, it could be misused. Definitely provably so. Those have been misused in the past. But then there's also situations in recent history, like in Ukraine, say, where access to those things is actually hugely beneficial.
Yeah.
And even gun control advocates think that civilian ownership of manpads in Ukraine is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So it all just depends on the time and place.
Yeah. And that law really just came into place after 9/11. So before that, You could totally own, from my knowledge, you could totally own it. And, there was no law against it, but obviously the cost of it and the complexity, it wasn't possible to really do it on a civilian scale. But it was only after, 9/11, they kind of clamped down like, hey.
Also, that sort of thing is so much easier to build nowadays than even when it was banned. It's just gotten so much easier. The number of people who have built open source autopilots for drones and quadcopters and all you need is a little bit better processor that can do more calculations per second, more corrections per second, and it's really just the same principles. I have heard throughout the years, and I'm not sure if this is actually true, but one of the reasons that there used to be serious controls on the CAM software, the computer-aided machining software for 5-axis CNC mills, is being able to do simultaneous 5-axis calculations is what you would put into that particular guidance system.
That would make sense, yeah. At the end of the day, the rocket is not too different to, what's been around. What, really changed the effectiveness was the guidance system.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to really struggle with that problem as technology gets even more advanced to where, like you said, someone manipulated, a CNC programming system to, control a rocket's, thrust and control a rocket, the fins to allow it to turn and guide. Yeah, they're probably going to, regardless of what the law is, there's going to be bad actors that are going to abuse technology. And that's not an excuse to really get rid of, civilian access to technology, but that's just a reality that we're going to face no matter what.
Yeah, the desire to do that is always going to exist. It is interesting to see how hard that gets, because so much of this stuff that used to be really hard to make is now 3D printable. I know that one of the major parts of those anti-air devices in the past was the sensor package to actually detect and track targets at long range. But I mean, you look at the optical capabilities of cell phones, and you look at the proliferation of thermal cameras. Like, cracking down on this stuff is really, really hard when there are so many beneficial applications that are out there, and it's so easy to source this stuff. So the old strategy of banning the tools and the information gets really, really hard at a certain level. And I think for a lot of technologies, we're way past that level. And 3D printed plastic small arms firearm frames are a clear demonstration of us being past that point where that knowledge can be restricted or that level. When it's $200 on YouTube to buy a 3D printer, yeah, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle for that particular manufacturing tech.
Definitely. I mean, there's no way they could, even if they wanted to ban all files, all legal ownership. I mean, you can, design it yourself in a CAD software. That's all open source. 2, you can technically print a 3D printer to print more. A lot of parts on a 3D printer can be printed. And there's a lot of DIY printers that can, you can build a printer. There's no putting that back, like you said, in the bottle. And, as metal 3D printing comes into the mix, so a lot of European countries ban specifically high pressure bearing parts, so like the bolt, the barrel, maybe like the hammer, something like that wouldn't be able to be made at a hardware store that would need like heat treating and is a high temp material. When metal 3D printing comes in, they're not going to be able to stop that. I mean, I'm sure there's settings eventually that you can harden materials in certain spots while it's printing, or you can anneal them or change the metallurgy of the part as it's printing. That, once that's on a consumer level, how do you stop that?
This is not a problem that, I would argue this is not a problem that needs to be solved, but this is not a problem that can be solved with just pure material control. If you want to do gun control, total gun control, you have to have total everything control eventually. So I think that some people actually are beginning to realize that. The governor of New York just promised, there's a bunch of executive orders that she rolled out today, but one of the things was to expand the definition of a firearm to cover a whole bunch of different parts, and it was very vague language. So it's like, oh, so springs are guns now. Okay. It's like, yeah, this is the only way we can control them is by calling everything a gun. So we live in interesting times, both technologically and culturally and legally. So you're doing fascinating work, and I would recommend that everybody listen to the podcast, go and buy the book, particularly the Fliegerfaust book, because I think that is way more interesting than the Panzerfaust. We're all pretty familiar with Panzerfaust and how they work, and so reading about rocket manufacture and testing and the historical side behind that is really, really neat. I haven't finished reading the book. I've been through it. Actually, I'm going to have to tell you a story about the book, and this can't be in the podcast, so hopefully I remember to edit this part out. But I would say this is a fascinating bit of research. Part of the reason that I don't mess around with stuff like this is I have a wife, I have children. I feel like this is an excellent pursuit for young, unattached men, preferably orphans. Orphans preferred. That's who should experiment with this stuff. But I do think everybody should buy the book, regardless of whether or not you plan to dabble in this area. Understanding some of this stuff is very important. I think supporting the work that you're doing would be important as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I always try to fire everything remotely. Especially with rockets. Nick was the only one that fired it over the shoulder, and I told him, I'm like, look, if anything goes wrong, I'm not responsible. I don't encourage you to do this at all. Please don't do it. And he's like, we have it out here. We need to shoot it over the shoulder. What's the point if you don't do it? At that point, we had fired 15 or so rockets. We knew they were pretty safe, but I've got a newborn, born in January, so So I wouldn't do it, but he was insistent. He said his family would understand, and he did it anyways.
I totally understand where he was coming from. I'm still going to scold him next time I see him, though. What are you thinking?
Yeah.
I know exactly what he was thinking.
We did have ballistic shields, and we try to shoot it as remote as possible. But there are some shots that we were pretty confident that it was safe, but, Nick, he's a wild man. I do have a lot of respect for him because I would not have done that. Without that, we wouldn't have got a lot of the shots. With a slow-mo camera, it wouldn't have been possible to record. There's a 4-second timer. You have 4 seconds to get a shot. The
super high-speed cameras are hard to work with, so I'm impressed by his technological abilities as well as by his bravery.
Yeah. I would put it that way.
Yeah. I'm sure that a lot of the listeners are pretty familiar with you. I think there's a lot of crossover between some of the stuff that T-Rex Arms wants to do and what you're doing. We don't do anything quite as cool. We bend plastic, in a little manufacturing facility, but we have really similar goals and interests, and so it's been really fun chatting. We will have another conversation about caseless ammo or semi-caseless ammo And then we'll figure out whether that's a public or a private conversation. Because
that could be a whole separate hour-long podcast in itself.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, the historical developments of caseless ammo. You were telling me earlier about a Daisy air rifle that was technically caseless propellant glued to the back of a .22 bullet and fired in an air rifle, but it ignited the pressure of the air going through the tiny nozzle, superheated the air to ignite the propellant. So for a long time, it was just an air rifle. And then the ATF realized, hang on, this is a firearm. We need to regulate this.
And it was the Daisy company, the air rifle company. So yeah, they stopped that right away as soon as they had to get an FFL or manufacturing license to do.
Yeah, that's when it stopped being a feasible commercial product.
But yeah, I'm more than happy to come back on if we want to discuss this at a later date. But I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you spending so long, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. So we'll continue to talk about what you're up to and tell people that they should buy your books. PDFs are very cool and all, but a neat thing about a book is it's a physically printed item that you can have that isn't going to change or be changed by somebody else or disappear quite as easily as ones and zeros. So I think having physical books is extremely important, and physical books about certain types of particular types of information extra important.